All right, subscribers, welcome back to another episode of Science with Surback. Today what we're going to be talking about is section 1.3, which deals with the scientific method. Now, before we get into the details of these notes, I want to outline a couple of objectives that you should be able to meet by the end of this video. So objective number 1, identify the common steps of scientific methods. Objective number 2, compare and contrast types of data. Objective number 3, compare and contrast types of variables. And objective number 4, describe the difference between a theory and a scientific law. So we start out here with the scientific method, and I'm going to give you a brief basic description here of what the scientific method is. So the scientific method is defined as a systematic approach used in scientific experiments and research. Now, the scientific method is an organized process used by scientists to do research. And what it also allows is for scientists to verify the work of others. Now, there are several steps of the scientific method. One step is observation. Another step is hypothesis. An additional step is experiments. Another step is conclusions. And an additional step is revised hypothesis. Now, it's very important to note that these steps do not have to be used in the same order each time. Now, because these steps of the scientific method don't have to be in the same order each time, it is going to require scientists to describe their methods that they use when they publish their results. Now, another important thing that goes along these lines of the steps here is that doubt is going to arise over the validity of the reported results if other scientists cannot confirm the results after repeating the method. Okay, so to help describe or to help show you what the scientific method is, I've provided this chart that can allow you to see why the steps don't necessarily have to be in order and what could be a result after a series of results in an experiment is proved over and over again. So we have here our scientific method developed here in our chart form. And so usually what we start out with is observations, and from those observations a hypothesis can be made. Now, after those two steps, really the next steps can be adjusted or modified. You can see here the chart that we have shows that the experiment's conclusions and revising hypothesis is in a cyclic manner. Now, what happens here is this. You may do an experiment and develop one conclusion and may have to go back and do more experiments before you can revise a hypothesis. Or you may do one experiment there and you may automatically have to revise your hypothesis. Again, the steps of the scientific method do not have to be in order. But after a while here, if you get continued results or the same results, you can then develop into this category over here on the right hand side, which we'll talk about later. So let's talk about here our first thing that most likely happens in the scientific method, and that is the fact of observations. So observations are going to usually start with scientists just beginning with a very simple observation. Now, these observations can be tabulated, or we can have numbers associated with them. And through observation, we can have two different types of data. One of which we're about ready to talk about is qualitative data. And another of which we'll talk about on the next page is quantitative data. So we start out here with qualitative data. And qualitative data is defined as the data that relates to the information that describes the color, odor, shape, or some other physical characteristic. Now, generally, qualitative data is going to be any data that relates to the five senses. So, in other words, the five senses is relating to how something looks, feels, sounds, tastes, or smells. So, like I said earlier, the other type of data that we can deal with is called quantitative data. Now, quantitative data is defined as data with numerical information describing how much, how little, how big, how tall, how fast, and things along that nature. And so examples of quantitative data include temperature, pressure, volume, quantity of a chemical formed, or how much of a chemical is used up in a reaction. So again, types of data, both qualitative and quantitative, are things that we can use to describe those observations, which is normally the first step in our scientific method. Now, another step here in the scientific method is the hypothesis. So, a hypothesis is defined as a tentative explanation for what has been observed. So this explanation is going to state what is believed to be happening through observations. Now, at this point with a hypothesis, no formal evidence has to support this statement. Now, an example of this would be scientists by the name of Molina and Rowan, what they did with chlorofluorocarbons and their hypothesis. Now, again, CFC just stands for chlorofluorocarbons. But what Molina and Rowan did is these were scientists that observed chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, in the stratosphere. And they were curious about how long CFCs could exist in the atmosphere. And so what they did is they examined the interactions that could occur among various chemicals in the troposphere. And they found out some unique things when they examined these interactions. One of which was that these chlorofluorocarbons were stable in the troposphere for long periods of time. And that the chlorofluorocarbons could drift up into the stratospheres. So from there, with these two ideas in mind, the scientists Molina and Rowan came up with the hypothesis was that the chlorofluorocarbons break down in the stratosphere due to interactions with ultraviolet light from the sun. Again, their hypothesis was that those chlorofluorocarbons break down in the stratosphere due to increased or interactions with ultraviolet light from the sun. So I want to point out a couple of things here. The observations are unique and can consist of a couple different forms. So these scientists found that this substance, the chlorofluorocarbons, existed in the stratosphere. And then they also used other observations from other experiments they may have found or other readings to combine those things that they found, their observations, and form that hypothesis. So the hypothesis is not something just a guess or a shot in the dark that a scientist may take. What they do is they have lots of observations and they use what they can see, and also they reach back to their prior knowledge and do some research within that field to come up with an hypothesis to explain what they're specifically seeing. So there's a lot more involvement than just making an educated guess about a particular observation. Now, the next idea or the next portion of the scientific method is experiments. And so experiments are defined as a set of controlled observation that tests the hypothesis. And so what these experiments are going to do is they are going to confirm or deny the hypothesis by using data. And so with experiments, it's again these controlled observations. And so to get controlled observations, scientists must carefully plan and set up laboratory experiments to change and test one variable at a time. So what we also have to think about here is this term of variables. Now, variables are defined as a quantity or condition that can have more than one value. All right, so moving on to the different parts of the experiment. So we started our last portion there with variables, and there's two different types of variables. Number one, there's an independent variable. And an independent variable is defined as the factor of the experiment that will be changed throughout the experiment. Now, the other type of variable is the dependent variable. And the dependent variable is defined as the factor of the experiment in which the value changes in response to a change in the independent variable. Now, it's important to remember here with the dependent variable that there is no control over the way in which the dependent variable changes. Now, some other terms to be familiar with an experiment is a constant. Now, the constant is defined as a factor that is not allowed to change during the experiment. Now, besides the independent and dependent variable, all other factors must stay the same throughout the entire experiment. Now, our last term is known as the control. And the control is defined as a standard for comparison in experiments. Now, let's use these different parts of the experiments in an example. So our example here that we are going to have is going to be an experiment in which the idea or the goal is to test the hypothesis that table salt dissolves faster in hot water than in water at room temperature. Now, in this type of experiment, the independent variable would be the temperature of the water. And it is the independent variable because we are adjusting or making our own modifications to what the temperature of that water is. Now, the dependent variable is the rate at which the salt dissolves. The control in our example here, the constant in our example would be the amount of salt, water, and amount you are stirring. And then the control would be room temperature water with no salt in it. Okay, so now we can move on to an additional part of the scientific method, and that is the conclusion. So the conclusion is defined as a judgment based on the information obtained. Now, a conclusion is formed when scientists take the data that have been analyzed and apply it to the hypothesis. Now, two types of data or two types of conclusions can be made from the results. One of the types of results is this. If data supports a hypothesis, the idea of the hypothesis may be true. Now, with this type of result, further evidence may support or not support this hypothesis. Now, the other type of result is this. If the data does not support the hypothesis, then the hypothesis must be discarded or modified. Now, as we talk about conclusions, we can also bring up the concept discussed earlier in this chapter about a model. And a model is defined as a visual, verbal, and or mathematical explanation of experimental data. Now, this model can be tested and used to make predictions. Okay, so before we move on to our next topic here, I want to reintroduce a chart that I talked about earlier in notes. And that chart is this one here discussed earlier. And so far in notes, we've talked about observations and a hypothesis, and we've also talked about experiments and conclusions. Well, if that data does support your hypothesis, usually what happens is there's further experiments, and if those further experiments still support your hypothesis, we can get into this category or this ring here that's going to talk about theories and eventually scientific law. So again, this is using that scientific method of talking about experiments, doing experiments, making conclusions, and seeing if it double checks or supports your hypothesis. And if it does, over time and time again, we can get to this concept called a theory. So a theory is defined as an explanation supported by many experiments. Now, a couple of key things with a theory. Again, this many experiments is very important. So you may get conclusions that support your hypothesis, and then further experiments go on to help support that hypothesis and provide more details or more explanation as to why that particular idea or concept is happening. Now, also here, a theory is going to state a broad principle of nature that has been supported over time. Now, a theory is subject to new experimental data and can be modified. And also, a theory is considered successful if it can be used to make predictions that are true. Now, a great example of a theory is Einstein's theory of relativity. So Einstein's theory of relativity is a way in which, or a theory in which, we have some connecting ideas between the universe and some physics concepts associated with it. Now, Einstein made this claim or made this idea, and since he's made that claim, there's been many experiments and many sets of data that have actually led to proving that his theory to be more and more correct. So again, a broad principle. It's explaining some major physics concepts of the universe, and there are many experiments that are supporting what Einstein says. Okay, so now, again, if we take a look back at that chart, we can get to our final portion here. We've talked about a theory. We can get to our final portion here, and that is going to a scientific law. Now, a scientific law is very important here, and it's a very important concept that we distinguish from a law and a theory. So a scientific law is defined as a relationship in nature that is supported by many experiments. Now, the key words here are relationship in nature. So it's going to provide an explanation for something that happens in nature. And it's going to occur when scientists come over and over again with the same conclusions about certain relationships in nature with no exceptions. So again, no matter what you do, you're always going to come to those same conclusions. That's a big difference between a law and a theory. A theory has a little wiggle room where additional experiments may alter the theory just slightly, but a law does not. You're going to come to that same result over and over again. Now, scientists develop further hypotheses and experiments to explain why these relationships in a scientific law exist. Now, a good example of a scientific law is Newton's law of gravity. Now, Newton was certain that an attractive force existed between all objects. And because he was certain about that, he proposed his law of universal gravitation. Again, the reason that Newton could propose this law of gravity is this key word here. He was certain. Okay, so because he was certain, meaning time and time again he got the same results no matter what happened, that's why he could propose this law of universal gravitation. All right, we've really jumped into a lot of details about how scientists do their work. We've distinguished between a law and a theory. We've identified the steps of the scientific method, and we have really seen how chemists can use this to do things like research and come up with new ideas and proposals. Hope you have enjoyed this episode, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe.